This session is one that I'm both excited about, hopeful for, and anxious about. We thought it would be an amazing idea to bring together three people from very different backgrounds. A professional, an eminent psychiatrist, Robin Murray, Luciana Berger, a local MP, who I know has a very special interest in mental health because I've heard her talk about it many times, and the lovely Debra Lampshire, who's the New Zealand contingent. But as well as that, she's an expert by experience, an educator, and an all-round brilliant person. The point of this is for them to talk for 15 minutes each about their contribution to real change, how they see it. And then for us to open it out to you guys for your thoughts, your questions, your concerns, your reflections. And then at the end, we'll each have a little bit of time, a couple of minutes each, just to make some reflections before we move on. I hope you found it enjoyable, and I'm going to hand over to Jan Olav.
So it's a pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Sir Robin MacGregor Murray. He's a professor of psychiatry at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College in London. Also has been a central member in the National Psychosis Unit in South London and Maudsley. He has chaired the Psychosis Research Group, perhaps the largest in the world when it comes to the number of papers. He's been a president of European Association of Psychiatrists, and he's also led, and that's not the least important here, the Schizophrenia Commission in 2011-12. And I think he will tell us that there are some recommendations that could be followed that has not been followed in that. Please, Sir Rob.
I think the reason that I'm invited is that 5 years ago I was the chairman of the Schizophrenia Commission, and this was a panel which Rethink, the charity, set up. And we had a senior civil servant as a member of it, and she said, don't call yourself a panel, call yourself a commission. Then if you ask a government minister to come, he or she will come because they'll think it's official. So we did this, and there were 13 of us, 2 people with experience, experts by experience, myself and another psychiatrist, a nurse, a social worker, journalist, and so on. And we spent 18 months looking at the quality of care of people with psychosis. We had the usual argument, should it be a psychosis commission or a schizophrenia commission? Half said one, half said the other, so we said we would look both at schizophrenia and other psychoses, although personally I prefer just to use the term psychosis. And what we found was, we concluded, as actually Jim Van Os said yesterday, a broken and demoralized system that doesn't deliver the quality of treatment that's needed for people to recover. And to our great surprise, we got a huge amount of publicity, and very sympathetic. Usually the media are interested in people with schizophrenia as mad axemen and crime and a lot of prejudice. But on this occasion they were very sympathetic, and we got a lot of support and help. There were some encouraging things. For example, there was a consensus that the causes, the etiology of psychosis is multifactorial. Now, there are still some dinosaurs who will say that schizophrenia, psychosis is totally genetic, or that it's totally social. But the experts that we invited, by and large, they agreed that people may have a particular susceptibility to different life events. And for example, I remember very clearly a discussion between Richard Benthal, great expert in child abuse, talking with a geneticist called Mike Owen about why is it that some people who are abused as a child go on to develop PTSD, others develop a depression, some develop psychosis, and some seem to be quite resilient. So I think it's important that we give credit to colleagues who are investigating and who are caring for people with psychosis, rather than squabble, particularly in front of politicians. If we go off to government ministers and squabble about the causes or the treatments available, then they pay no attention to us. And this has been a great besetting sin of our field in the past. There was, I am sure our chairman will be pleased to know, or our co-chairman will be pleased to know, that there were some areas that were excellent, and in particular the early intervention teams. Every area in Britain has an early intervention team, and they have a holistic approach, and they were much liked by those who were using these services. Similarly, home treatment was very much appreciated. There were many recommendations about particular members of staff. Kindness, caring, and understanding were what people appreciated. I think Debra talked about this yesterday afternoon. These seem to be the core features that made some people have a positive therapeutic influence and others not so much. But there were lots of problems. Mental health workers tended to be too pessimistic, and I'll come back to that later. One of the reasons for that is, of course, that if you're a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a psychiatric nurse, you see the people who are not doing so well. The people who come to see you once and you look after them for 2 or 3 months, and then they recover, they go back to their normal life, you never see them again. They don't knock on your outpatient clinic and say, I just thought I'd drop in to tell you I was doing fine. So preferentially, the people in the services see people who are not doing quite so well. One of the big problems in Britain is that people have no choice about the psychiatrist or the team that looks after them. If you live in a particular area, there will be a psychiatric team for this area, and that team will look after people in this area. That's fine if it's a good team, but if it's a rubbish team, it's very difficult to escape from them. At times, almost impossible. So the other thing that we found was, if you find a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a nurse that you get on really well with, you want to stick with them. But our system here is so disorganized that every so often they change the configuration of the services, and you lose the person that you get on well with. Sometimes you lose the person that you didn't get on well with, so that can be an advantage. But continuity of care. Yesterday I had an email from a man I looked after 20 years ago, and he was just telling me how he was getting on, and in many ways he was getting on very well. He said, I have nobody to talk to about my medication. He just takes a minimum dose, because he said, in 20 years I've had 22 psychiatrists, and I'm just about to meet my 23rd, but he's only a locum. He'll only be here for a few months. So that kind of service is hopeless. There was not enough psychological therapy. Patients and families weren't enough involved in decisions, and worst of all, the inpatient units were often anti-therapeutic. Jim Van Os talked yesterday about how in Holland they have, they're trying to cut down the number of beds. Now in Holland they have, I worked it out last night, they have 3 times more beds per head of population than we had in 2008. We used to have lots of beds, and they gradually declined, and I think 10 years ago we probably had about the right number of beds, inpatient beds, or alternative places alternatives to inpatient care. But, and we had taken the money from these old inpatient beds and put them into the community. But since 2008, we've shut inpatient beds, and we've not had any money to put into the community. So it's been disastrous. And as a consequence, as you can see here, the number of beds in blue has declined, and the paradox is that as we're supposedly moving into the community, we've had twice as many people being detained in inpatient wards. Well, why is that? It's because if you've been in one of these bad wards and you've been subject to the inhumanity and anti-therapeutic atmosphere in some of them, not by any means all of them, but in the big cities particularly, you do not want to go voluntarily again. So even if things are very grim, you try and stay out. And so sometimes people who are at particular risk to themselves or others are sectioned into an inpatient psychiatric bed. They would have been pleased to have gone into a place that was therapeutic. So I think we're in a situation where we don't necessarily need more beds, but we do need more resources to make these places therapeutic. Why are we having particular troubles in Britain? And I know London best. Well, we know something about what increases the risk of psychosis. And we did a study where we looked at South London, Nottingham, and Bristol. And we found that the incidence of psychosis was 3 times higher in South London. Now, since we have a politician here, you may think this is because there's lots of mad ideas come out of Westminster and infect the local population, not from your side of the House, Luciana. No, of course, it's nothing to do with that. It's just that big cities, being born and brought up in a big city, increases your chances of going psychotic. Probably to do with social integration, a lack of social integration, fragmentation. So in South London, there's one area, Clapham, where you're 9 times less likely to be psychotic than another area, Lewisham. And the best predictor of this, again, Luciana, I'll be interested to know this, is whether if you live in an area where people vote in a local or a general election. Where people don't vote, then there's a high incidence of psychosis. This is because if you live in an area, you identify with it, you know your neighbours, you feel you can contribute and that you participate. If you live in a tower block where you're frightened of being mugged in the lifts and there's drug dealers down the corridor, you don't vote and you're more at risk of psychosis. We know that people who are from an ethnic minority or migrants have an increased risk, and this is well established. We know that people who have had an adverse childhood have an increased risk, and we know that people who are victimised or exposed to crime have an increased risk. I tell you of a chap in our care who was doing very well, 21-year-old, a regular job, witnessed a murder down the street, and gave a statement to the police. He was then visited by friends of the murderers who said, I don't think you wish to make a statement in court. It wouldn't be good for your life expectancy. Well, I don't think they put it quite like that. But of course, he withdrew his statement and because he was frightened. He began thinking this gang was following him. He began thinking they were peering in through his windows, then had cameras. Then he began hearing them speaking about them, became frankly psychotic, had to come into hospital. He got better, went home, he was doing fine. Somebody down the street was not murdered, but was attacked with a knife. He had a relapse. So if you're in that sort of atmosphere, you're more prone to develop paranoid ideas. So we know that psychosis is particularly common in those who are socially excluded and alienated. And I think it gives us an avenue. We need to do something about our inner cities. And we need to do something to make migrants and people from minorities feel more part of the general community. Childhood adversity is difficult to address, but crime we can also address. But perhaps the biggest risk factor which has changed in recent years is drug abuse, and particularly high-potency cannabis. So this is the risk of being a patient or a healthy person in South London, depending on what type of cannabis you use. And so this is a study where this would be the people who didn't take cannabis and their risk. Here are people who take old-fashioned hash, resin. It almost looks as if it's protective, but it's not. It's not significant, but it's daily use of high-potency cannabis, what we call skunk in the UK. Old-fashioned cannabis has about 4% of the active ingredient THC. Skunk has about 16%. And if you are taking a skunk every day in South London, you're 5 times more likely to develop psychosis. So in Britain, we now know, or people know widely, that you need to think what kind of cannabis you're using. High-potency cannabis is called skunk because of the smell. And everybody knows if you're given some cannabis, you need to sniff it and know exactly what it is. So the Queen gets a lot of gifts, and she's learned this. But how do we compare in Britain with the rest of Europe? And we've done a study where we've looked across Europe at big cities, and we've also looked in more rural places. And this is just the incidence of psychosis. And you can see that here is London. We're not best at many things, but we have the most people with psychosis. Here is Amsterdam. Here is Paris. You can see Cambridgeshire is much lower. Rural France is much lower. Leiden is much lower. But also that southern Europe has much lower rates. So if you live in Santiago in Spain, you're 10 times less likely to be psychotic than if you live in South London. What are the reasons for that? Could it be the Mediterranean diet? Could it be migration? It probably is such an effect. What do Italy and Spain have that, say, Holland and Britain don't have? The Pope? Could it be the Pope? He's a good chap, obviously, but it probably is unlikely to be that. But it could be families. And could it be high-potency cannabis? And this is a correlation between cannabis use and the incidence of psychosis across Europe. And you can see that here are the rates of psychosis. Here is cannabis use in the population. Here is Santiago. Here is Palermo. Here is Amsterdam, London, and Paris. So it looks as if high-potency cannabis is one of the factors. So my message, does that mean I have to stop? It does, I think, actually, yes. My message would be that I think it's important to get involved in prevention. And the most obvious way of prevention is to try and persuade people not to take amphetamines or methamphetamine or cocaine, but particularly high-potency cannabis or spice or these synthetic cannabinoids. But also, I think, to do something about the circumstances that some of our population are brought up in the inner cities, that these are places where people become excluded and isolated and more prone to psychosis. And I think I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, Robin. Is there sound? Yeah. Thank you, Robin, for that. Now it's a pleasure to introduce Luciana Berger. She's an MP from Liverpool since 2010. And she has also been, still are perhaps, a shadow minister of public health or mental health since 2015-16 in the shadow government. So please, Luciana.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for that introduction. I'll clarify a few points in a moment. As you heard, my name's Luciana. I'm one of the 5 local MPs here in Liverpool, and my constituency, Wavertree, starts just up the road. I'm absolutely delighted to join you. I should say it's my first event back after maternity leave, and I can't think of anything more exciting and interesting to be at, so wonderful to be here. Thank you, if I can also say, for choosing to hold your conference here in Liverpool. If you haven't had a chance to look around our fantastic city, I urge you to do so. We thrive and endeavour to always do what we've always done, which is to extend a warm welcome to people from all around the world, and I understand there's people from 44 countries here today, so please enjoy your time here in this city. I know that we are joined at this conference by lots of people who are experts by experience, and I'm really excited to have listened to the presentation we've just heard, but also the contributions from the floor and from an expert by experience in a moment. It's worth me pointing out from the beginning that I am not either an expert by experience or a clinician. I am, however, a politician who is very, very committed to this area. I was previously the Shadow Minister for Public Health for the Labour Party from 2013. I then served as the first ever Shadow Cabinet Minister for Mental Health. I now sit as an elected member of our Health Select Committee, and I'm President of the Labour Party's Campaign for Mental Health. And it's fair to say I'm one of the few MPs, there's 650 MPs in the UK, and I'm one of the few that chooses to really focus on this area in everything that I do. I've been asked to say a few words about the social and political aspects of psychosis, about how our public policy is responding to our developing understanding of this bag of complex life experiences that we call psychosis. And I use the phrase, this bag of complex life experiences, because it seems to me to capture something of our understanding of it today. We've had a very eloquent explanation just now from Robin, but it's worth me adding my comprehension as a non-expert and someone who's working in this field in a very political sense. The hallucinations, delusions, and disordered thinking that are so often associated with psychosis are too often taken to define it in its entirety. We're given to believe that some people hear voices or experience paranoia, and they have a psychotic illness. Some people don't have those experiences, and so in contrast, they don't have an illness. And of course, we know it's nowhere near as simple as that. As the Mental Health Foundation points out, most people have had at least one experience of hearing a voice when there was no one around them, and yet most people are not diagnosed with psychosis. Something else is going on. There is a more complex context, and I believe the more that we acknowledge that complexity, the more we will understand. And if I can use the comparison of cancer, it was only a few decades ago that cancer was very much seen as a single disease. Some people got it, some people didn't. Very little thought was given to prevention. Treatment was pretty basic if it was available at all, and it was brutal and often not very effective. And yet today, cancer is now understood as hundreds of different diseases. Some have genetic foundations that increase an individual's risk of developing a particular form. Many people have no family history, but their individual life experiences increase their risk of developing one or more cancers. Many more are exposed to risks by the way we organise our workplaces and our communities, and the stresses and strains that we are subjected to, and by allowing smoking or allowing cars and factories to pollute our air. And I believe that we are on a similar journey of understanding with mental health in general and psychosis in particular. And while we've had many commissions along the way, we do, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, have some way to go. If we look at the social determinants of psychosis, and again, forgive me, I'm echoing a lot of what we've just heard, but it's, again, I think worth hearing it in a different context. It is true that anyone can experience psychosis, but it's also true that where we are born and grow up and our life experiences matter as predictors of risk. I'm not going to rehearse what we've just heard about genes, but again, it's worth me saying also, I acknowledge the fact that people at higher risk tend to live in cities, they experience poverty, especially in childhood, they experience racism, they are exposed to childhood traumas, such as sexual or physical abuse, they are often bullied by their peers. However, instead of investing in public health, prevention and early intervention, we all pay too high a price for dealing with the crises that follow from failing to deal with those social determinants of psychosis. And whatever the description and however you want to look at it, the impact is serious. And of course, however we describe it, the impact of living in a world that does not understand you, or you it, whether or not you have been medically diagnosed with a psychosis, I believe, and I know from, again, listening to people that live with the experience, can be serious and traumatic in itself. We will all be aware of the terrible headline figure that someone with a diagnosis of schizophrenia is likely to live 20 years fewer than someone without that diagnosis, not because of their mental health condition, but almost certainly because of the poor physical health care that they will experience alongside it. I attended the annual general meeting of our local Liverpool clinical commissioning group just a few weeks ago, and there were presentations given by primary care doctors about it was almost a celebration of all the things that happened over the course of the past year. And the head of primary care got up and in her presentation pointed to many physical health indicators, but her one reference to anything to do with mental health was about those people, and I hate the acronym, but SMI, someone experiencing a serious mental illness. And they celebrated the fact that, forgive me, the figures aren't exactly accurate, but it was from 43% to 48% of people locally in this city with a serious mental illness were now accessing their physical health check. And I said in the responses and the opportunity that I had, I sat in the audience, the idea that this is somehow an achievement or a celebration that less than 50% of people in our city were accessing their physical health check, someone with a serious mental illness, I think, had a lot to be desired. And that for me is just one little anecdote of the challenge that we face, and I'll go on to talk about it in a moment, of the difference in how we treat physical health and mental health, when in fact we should be treating it as a whole. Indeed, across all life measures, the social impact of psychosis is huge, and another one that I'm particularly concerned about is employment. Only 43% of all people with a mental health condition, in our national figures show, are in employment, compared to 74% for our general population. And again, if we look at, we don't like labels, but if we look at the figures that we've got for someone with the diagnosis of schizophrenia, it's just 8%. And that's despite the fact that 2/3 of people with a mental health condition who were unemployed said that they really wanted to work or were looking for work. And the last time that I asked our local mental health trust here in Liverpool, Merseycare, they told me that just 3% of the patients they were looking after were in or that were under their care were in employment. And that impact on our society is huge too. The Schizophrenia Commission, the report from 2012, estimated that the cost of psychosis to our society as a whole was a staggering £11.8 billion every year. That's almost a fifth of what we spend on our entire national health service. And we know also from a recent report that came out from the Care Quality Commission, this is the body that's charged with looking at the quality of care of all our health services. It came out just a couple of months ago, that still we know too many people are staying for too long in very restrictive care settings, and yet almost 20% of our entire mental health budget goes on secure care. And what's even worse is the experience of people from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic population, which found that in 2010, men from these communities spent twice as long in hospital or in secure settings on average. We all rightly celebrate the huge scientific advances in the medical treatment of cancers, but now more than ever we talk about living with cancer because successful medical interventions have become widely available. For instance, we now have the vaccination that reduces the risk of contracting the HPV virus that leads to the development of cervical cancer. But sitting alongside those medical advances that treat or prevent cancers are the social and public policy advances that matter as well. Here in the UK, we've introduced standardised tobacco packaging. We've ended smoking in cars where children are sat in the back. We've banned smoking in workplaces and public places. We've cleaned up the air from our factories. We need to go on that same journey with mental health. And far too often, the only treatment option available to someone experiencing the negative impact of psychosis has been medication. I should make it clear, standing here on the podium, that personally I'm not against drug treatments. I know that some people are, but I'm not. But I welcome the fact that previously from 2002 onwards, we saw the introduction of newer atypical drug treatments for schizophrenia that became more widely available. They were seen as having fewer and less severe side effects and better enabling recovery. However, as we know now, the atypicals have their own serious side effects, including weight gain that can contribute to the high incidence of physical health problems amongst people with psychosis, which goes on to shorten lives. But now we need to be campaigning for more than access to medication. In the UK, NICE, which is our National Institute for Clinical Excellence, recommends that any drug treatments are offered alongside cognitive behavioural therapy and family intervention. I don't need to tell you that there are two problems with this advice. Firstly, we would agree that it's far too difficult in our country for people to access those talking therapies, CBT or family intervention, particularly in a timely basis. Our waiting lists are far too long. It's all too easy for people to be given drugs, but not to be given that talking therapy that should accompany it. And it was the 2012 National Audit of Schizophrenia that found that 34% of people currently being treated had not been offered any form of psychological therapy. The second problem is that many people, and I've heard them make these arguments very eloquently, that there is mounting evidence that other forms of psychological interventions are also effective and in our country should be recommended by our National Institute for Clinical Excellence. So what's clear from the cancer analogy is that we are still a long way from fully understanding an individual's experience of psychosis in all its complexity, and how in some instances psychosis may be understood as the expression of negative or traumatic personal and social life experiences from birth through childhood into adolescence and adulthood, and also the impact of our surroundings. We need to develop our understanding and set that understanding in the right context, not least because that will allow us to properly support someone affected by psychosis, however that comes to be understood, and develop the social and public health interventions that are analogous to the cancer experience of tackling smoking and cleaning the air to prevent cancers in the first place. What already stares us in the face, though at a public policy level we do too little to acknowledge it, is that mental health is not an issue for our Department of Health alone. Our Secretary of State for Health cannot alone solve our national mental health crisis. And I say it's a crisis because I believe that we do have a mental health crisis in our country. It's what happens in our schools, in our places of learning, in our workplaces, in our communities and our homes that I believe ultimately will make the biggest change. And if we can identify the adjustments that at a societal level would reduce the incidence of psychosis, we really will have made some progress. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a social movement made up of people who use mental health services, the voluntary sector, professionals and academics, that have shown us that it is possible to shift public attitudes to mental health. Here in the UK, particularly in the last few years, we're talking about mental health a lot more. The issue really has been forced onto the political agenda. When I started in the brief in 2012, it's mentioned just a few times in Parliament. If we look over the course of the past year, it's been mentioned many, many more times from the dispatch box on both sides of the House of Commons. We, I believe, and from our position, pushed it onto the agenda. I say we because there's many of us involved. Particularly, it was my colleagues, my Labour colleagues in the House of Lords. Forgive me for making a party political point, but it was my Labour colleagues in the House of Lords that put forward an amendment that said that in our country we should have parity of esteem for mental health. It was an amendment to the Health and Social Care Act in 2012, and by fluke, not because it was actually voted against by government members of the House of Lords, but by the support of Liberal Democrats when we had that vote in 2012, it became statute, it became law. And we're now supposed to have equality for mental health in our country. And yet the Care Quality Commission report that I just referred to has exposed the reality. We are very, very far from real equality, real parity of esteem in this country. We know that too many people can't get any help, too many people are facing long waits, too many people are spending too long in restrictive care in hospitals. Too many people are being sent very, very far away from home, separated from their friends and family. We've seen a reduction of mental health nurses in our country, over 7,700 fewer mental health nurses since 2010. The number of detentions under the Mental Health Act is up by 26% since 2012. We've seen workforce shortages, unsuitable buildings, and poor clinical information systems that are posing serious challenges to any kind of, I believe, real improvement to our mental health services. And indeed, that report only looked at what happened in inpatient settings, and actually what happens in our communities is even more important. I tweeted just the other day, if anyone's on Twitter, I'm at my name, at Luciana Berger. And the irony, our public health body, Public Health England, tweeted an infographic, a picture of where local communities, local councils could get a return on investment for their local population's mental health. And the irony of them doing this when it was almost seen that this body is divorced from the rest of government. Previously, before 2010, we used to connect all of our different departments. There used to be at cabinet office level a committee that came together and talked about public health and prevention. Not just talked, but actually made some real tangible changes. That doesn't exist anymore. Oh, I'm being told to wind up. And so Public Health England now kind of sit almost as an island. In terms of what I believe we should do, that's what's ultimately most important. We need to not just look at money, but money is important. The money hasn't come forward. We've had lots of promises in our country of money that should be apportioned to mental health. It hasn't been delivered. There's opportunities through our Health Select Committee in Parliament to make a change. That's where I'm going to focus my efforts. I'm president of Labour's campaign for mental health. We're going to continue within my party to listen to what people have to say, to develop those real differences that we believe can be made. I believe ultimately, if we can protect children and adults from emotional, physical or sexual abuse, if we can work collectively to create a more humane society, and if we can reduce poverty, especially childhood poverty, and reduce the financial and social inequality we see in our country, ultimately we will make the greatest difference to reducing levels of psychosis in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luciana. And now it's the user perspective. Debra Lampshire, whom you all know, I guess. She's from New Zealand, from the University of Auckland, working as a mental health educator, and has, before that, worked in consumer advisory service. She talks with lived experience. She's the chair of ISPS New Zealand, and she's also part of the international ISPS EC. So please, Debra.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koe Robin, tēnā koe Lucy, tēnā koe Rachel, tēnā koe Yanov. Just a greeting in Māori as a thank you for allowing me to speak in your land. And I must say, I think this is the first time I've been in the presence of two psychiatrists and a member of parliament and not been in handcuffs. I must say, it's strangely liberating. Okay. But now I shall put my appropriate, the glasses mean that I now become intellectual, as you all know, and I will talk about my bit, okay? Change in terms of politically, I've categorised it that way, apologies to Richard Bentle. So politically, I think we need to tackle the factors that influence mental health. Poverty, poor housing, abuse are all social determinants that require a social and political movement to address. We need to be able to offer continuity for service users so services are not vulnerable to the whims and wiles of political forces and changes in government, nor are they subject to the financial constraints incorporated into the political dogma embraced by any singular party. Mental health needs to be placed on a social justice and citizenship platform. If governments are servants of the people, then we must familiarise ourselves with the established processes and protocols to strengthen our position and demand services which meet the needs of the community, utilising legislative and legal rights to ensure that service users are not disenfranchised nor discriminated against. All stakeholders must lobby, service users, family, clinicians, with a solution-focused approach. We must engage the public to make this a human issue, not secrete ourselves away. Far from being marginalised, mental health needs to be given the same priority given to social services and physical health. And advisors to the government need to come from a service user background, and we should be advocating for services that have a recovery philosophy, are service user-led and driven, use the least restrictive practices and environments, not accept discriminatory practices, are accessible and flexible, use respectful, open communication, take a collaborative approach, provide information freely, convey hopefulness, support and engage with families, take a whole-of-life approach, have good linkages with other services and social agencies and support networks, avoid the use of force, maximise choices, demonstrate cultural and spiritual awareness, invest in and champion peer support and services, ensure involvement and advocacy of service users at all levels of governance. We must also ensure that universities and learning institutes maintain high standards and not become revenue collecting establishments. And we must actively recruit and make mental health a vibrant and interesting career option with many and varied career paths. We must have the courage to explore new ways of working with people and invest in alternative options so there is an array of services. From a professional perspective, first and foremost, we need to believe that people do get better. This may require an attitudinal shift for some. This may be evolution, for others, a revolution. We need to be transparent in our approaches with all stakeholders. We need to ensure that at every decision-making opportunity, service users are at the table on equal footing, so we can develop integrative services informed by service users and examine the multiple approaches drawn on by those service users. We must embrace diversity and ensure there are no taboo topics. We need to acknowledge the impact of racism, of abuse, of sexuality, of spirituality, and culture that play in people's lives, and acquaint ourselves with the fundamentals and know how to access experts in that field, whether they be pastors, elders, or community leaders. We must ensure that family are involved and kept informed. There needs to be an open discourse on the power and control issues that serve to disempower service users and challenge the risk-adverse environment that influences so much of our decision-making. There must be service user integration at all levels of service development and delivery. We must ensure there are mechanisms that allow feedback for service users and family, and that feedback is taken seriously and acted upon. It would be beneficial if clinicians engaged in co-productive research that service users considered relevant. Funding must be available for research that explores non-pharmacological approaches and is service user-led and driven. Autonomy and compassion must be the cornerstone of practice, and there must always be accountability. Established systems are founded on evaluation, judgment, diagnosis, and categorization, not necessarily on what's in the best interest of clients. If safety becomes the primary mantra of services, then there is little room for change, and we will become conservative instead of courageous in our choices. And I want to talk about 4 domains in particular that I have identified. First domain is choice. Service users can make their own decisions about how they choose to lead their own lives. Service users have the right to choose the direction and the means of their own recovery. The more choices available to me, the more in control I will feel. If service users are unable to make a decision due to distress, it can be helpful to have a mutually negotiated agreement in advance. Involvement. Service users should be involved in the planning, implementation, and evaluation of their own recovery process. Involvement is empowering and motivating. A community focus. An emphasis is placed on building and using existing resources, helping to reconnect with resources and support where the person chooses to live and are familiar and accessible is helpful. Uprooting people from their natural resources and supports adds another unnecessary layer of adjustment and stress. Lastly, strengths. Enhancing service users' natural strengths and resources that can be utilised during challenging times. Not focusing on an illness paradigm, but rather a wellness one, and acknowledging and building on personal strengths long developed. We need to stop blaming the system. It is not an ethereal being. It has been created by people, and it can be disassembled and recreated by people. We must use any influence and take every opportunity we have and combine our efforts with service users and family and any other interested parties to voice what is required to meet service users' requirements. We do many things well in mental health, and one thing that we excel in is taking simple situations and making them hugely complicated. It justifies our position and conveys our status. Common sense plays little role in mental health, and I can hear the rumblings now. Oh, but she doesn't know the complexity and demands of our role and our system. I am the complexity and the demand of your system. Saying we need to simplify does not mean it will be easy. Don't confuse the two. We must nurture our students to ensure they see mental health as a viable, satisfying and rewarding profession, and good people stay. We need to ensure they are mentored into positions rather than overwhelmed by them, with people of stature and identified as leaders in their field. They should not be renounced for spending too much time with clients ever, but encouraged to share all the latest knowledge and research they bring with them. We must continue to teach students the ideal rather than the mediocre, even though we may send them out into a sometimes less than ideal environment. We may not be able to change the system overnight, but what we are in control of is the time spent with service users, and the role of relationships is paramount. Never underestimate the power of relationship. Genuine trust, compassion, curiosity, concern, and empathy has a greater impact than any therapeutic milieu. This is the chance to be an individual reformist. This is your chance to demonstrate that there is value in talking and listening to people. This is your time to shine, and it will be noticed, I can assure you. This is your time to believe in your own power as mental health workers to make a difference. On a personal perspective, as service users, we've filled in all your forms. We have been your research subjects. So you will find out all the things that we have known for years. We have fed back and dialogued and attended forums and conferences, and yet we do not see our feedback, recommendations, or ideas implemented. It is frustrating and it's disheartening, but we have no choice. We just have to battle on. There are times we need to reflect on what has changed, and things have changed. For someone like myself who has been in the mental health service since I was 12 years old, I have seen tremendous change, so I know it's possible. Currently, though, we seem a little static. It is time for our next leap of faith to build on the considerable amount of knowledge we have already amassed and just bloody get on with it. Clients need to be in a position to take control of their own well-being and have access to a variety of approaches, including service user-driven and operated services. Service users should be able to determine their preferred treatment options and take more responsibility to negotiate. Records should be held by clients. Okay. I have come up with a little bit of a wish list, to be honest, in terms of if things did change and some of the implications were brought about. And these are the sort of things I would hope for service users. Number one, shameless self-promotion. I hope you'll join ISPS. I hope that your spiritual and cultural needs are given the significance that you do. I hope you do not experience stigma and discrimination in the community, but acceptance and understanding. I hope that you choose your vocation because it is what you wish to do, not what others think you're capable of. I hope you will create a personal vision of your future and have the confidence to move toward it. I hope you will take every opportunity to have your say. Don't wait, create it. You are the expert on yourself. No one knows more about you or your history than you, and only you know when it feels right. Know your rights and exercise them. Always question, seek additional information, and decide for yourselves. And never take no from someone who didn't have the power to say yes in the first place. Develop a life outside of services so you don't become dependent on them to fulfill your needs. Learn to advocate for yourself and be prepared to take appropriate action when needed. Endeavour to take responsibility for your own physical well-being and ensure you take your health checks. Consider love and compassion towards yourself as your guiding principle. Get to know yourself. Know the signs that you are having difficulties. Create a support network and have a reciprocal agreement. Establish clear conditions and criteria for proxy responses if you're deemed incapable of making decisions for yourself. Push for the development of a range of services which truly meets your needs. Be active in your own recovery and lobby for effective, relevant services. I hope you will not let your past define your future. I hope that you will know how courageous and resilient you are. I've had the little hope list, and what I'd like to do now, I'd actually work with a fact. I'd like to, and if you would just allow me and indulge me a little bit, I'd like some participation from the audience. First of all, I would like family members to stand, please. I would like any practitioners who have cried with and for their clients. I would like any practitioner who has had a sleepless night over one of their clients. I would like you to stand if you have learnt more working and talking to service users than out of a textbook. I would like you to stand if you've got into trouble for spending far too much time with clients. For service users, I say to you, whenever you feel that you're a burden, whenever you feel that you are not worth it, I want you to remember this room. I want you to remember these people that you don't even know who stand up with, for, and beside you. When you are plagued by demons and tormented and defiled, you remember this moment and everyone that stood for you. For every demon and torment, there are 10 of us. And I want you to remember, in true Liverpudlian fashion, that you never walk alone. And that, my darlings, is an absolute fact. Thank you.
else feel like they can't speak? Yeah, Debra did it, and I've got tears, and I'm trying not to cry in public. So thank you, Debra. But very, very powerful. And also, what struck me from each of our three speakers is we know what needs to change at the core. There's so many similarities from the three different positions. But this is your time. We're curious what you want to change, what you think needs to change, but importantly, how do we do it? Because we say the same things, but change is slow at the moment. I think we've got some roving microphones being gathered, so I'm just going to blather at you for a minute. Oh, here they are with our glorious assistants, Jim and John. If you have something you'd like to say, it could be a perspective, it could be a question, a reflection, do make yourselves known. There's some people in the middle there, John. If you head back, grab John, if you like. Probably not physically.
I'm not grabbing John physically. Is this on? Yes? Great.
Could you say your name as well?
Hi, I'm Gail Hornstein from the USA. I want to, I think on behalf of everyone, thank all our speakers who really provided very, very impassioned and quite, as Ray just said, quite similar perspectives. I wonder if we could just now move, what I would really like is to see the next level of specificity of especially reflecting on some of the things that Luciana said about what concretely, and perhaps you're working on some of these yourself, could be done as matters of social policy or as initiatives that would be, for example, to use your analogy, analogous to outlawing smoking in cars where children are present, or in pubs and clubs, or in restaurants or in public places. There's a public health initiative that has made a vast difference in people's physical health that wasn't done by their own individual initiative, but was a matter of public health. There's an example. I'll give one positive example from my area of the world. In Western Massachusetts, where I live, thanks to the wonderful work of the peer organization, Western Massachusetts Recovery Learning Community. I really encourage you to check them out online, westernmassrlc.org. They have created a peer respite. This is a tremendously supportive context in a house, an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood, where people who are in the midst of a crisis can go as an alternative to going to an emergency room in a hospital. It has prevented many, many people from having to end up on a path of going to hospital. It's entirely peer run, it's entirely peer staffed, and it makes a gigantic difference to many people's lives. As another example, I've read about a pilot program in the UK in which GPs were encouraged to provide a, quote, prescription for someone to get a low-cost membership in a local gym instead of giving them an antidepressant for mild depression. I thought that was a very good example of an initiative that could easily be done, didn't cost anything, and made it possible for people to think about treating mild depression in a different way than automatically getting an antidepressant. I really welcome some concrete, specific ideas like those. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that question and contribution, and to hear what's happening in your area. I mean, forgive me, I'm going to make some political points. You'd expect me to do that, but I say that disclaimer at the start of my response. I'm a Labour MP. We're in opposition. We did not win the last, regrettably, the last general election. We haven't been in power since before 2010. Next time, fingers crossed. And if I can reflect on things that were done under the previous Labour government that made a difference to keeping well in their communities, that unfortunately we've seen across the country either cut back or have disappeared altogether. And these are things that, in my view, really make a difference to people's both their physical health and their mental health, most importantly in the context of the conversation that we're having today. So if we look at the whole life course, if we start with the first 1,001 days of a child's life, from conception through to 2, that we know has such an impact on their life chances and life outcomes. Over 3,000 children's centres were created in this country up until 2010. We know that 700 of those children's centres have seen their doors closed since 2010, and many more have seen services reduced. Those centres make a difference to keeping people well, to supporting new mums and dads, to supporting those infants up until the age of 2. If we look at youth services, if we listen to young people tell us that where they turn to speak to a trusted adult, where they're most likely to turn to, if it's not a parent, is a youth worker. Again, youth services make a difference. Many places in my own constituency, those doors have closed. We need to reopen them. If we look at the difference that can be made in schools beyond academic education, we need to look at schools not just as a place where, academics is really important, but that alone is not going to equip the next generation to contend with the stresses and strains of 21st century living. Many schools that were actually very passionate about their young people's mental health, again, had the budgets previously to do things like provide support through peer mentors or through educational psychologists, through additional activities that weren't just under the purely academic umbrella. Again, those budgets need to be made available. And it's not just, I like to put it, or I don't like to put it, but I have to put it in the economic context, because while these things, inverted commas, cost money, the cost of not providing them actually is so much more. And our system now is so geared in this country now towards what we do when someone's in a crisis, that it doesn't make sense. I'm driven by the social and moral reasons why it's so important to help people early on, to help them stay in their relationships with their family and friends, to keep them in school or in education or in a job. And if you're not even motivated by those reasons, the financial impacts of not dealing with those situations earlier on. The example you gave of what happens in your own area, we had in this city 6 drop-in centres for people that might be on the verge of a crisis and that just need a bit of extra support. Now we've got 1. And again, in other parts of the country, those doors have closed. Leisure and outdoor services, again, so important. Play, really important. Again, the budgets aren't there. And what happened was that the funding, the formula to decide what area gets what money was essentially they took out the weighting for deprivation. So this city, Liverpool, one of the most deprived cities in the country, they took out the weighting for deprivation, and we now have £350 million less than what we had in 2010. If we had the average cut, if they'd maintained, if the pie had been cut in a different way or even if they'd reduced the money but they'd applied the same funding formula, we'd have at least an extra £30 to £40 million a year to provide some of those things, again, that keep people well in their communities. Loneliness. Massive issue. Befriending services, they cost so little in comparison to what we have to spend on to keep people well. Again, if you look at through the whole life course, these are things that might make a difference. And so it's not just about replacing what we had. You mentioned social prescribing. Again, that can make a massive difference. We do that here in the city, but I'd like to see at least us to return to the levels of those services that we know made a difference previously.
Thank you. Okay, really brief, just because I really need to hear.
Could I just echo much of what Luciana said, but particularly the question of social exclusion. I think that was one good thing that the Labour government did, was to try and lessen the social exclusion, which is a big contributor to psychosis. The question of cigarettes and cancer has come up several times. The biggest killer of patients with serious mental illness is cigarette smoking. And it's been estimated that 70% of the loss of life of people with serious mental illness is due to smoking. Not only that, but the evidence is that smoking makes psychosis worse, and there are now studies suggesting that smoking tobacco may actually contribute to the onset of a psychosis. Studies show that when psychiatric units stop allowing smoking, that the level of violence decreases, very surprisingly. So I think there's many reasons that we should adopt the policies that have been advocated in relation to smoking, in particular for the health of people with serious mental illness.
Thank you.
I think we'll give the panel 2 minutes each in the end of this session, so we know we'll have some questions and comments also from,
So we can gather some, because I think otherwise we'll spend a lot of time up here because we've got a lot of ideas. So there's someone back there. Hello, can you say your name?
Hi, so I'm Che Rosebert. I'm a psychologist and I chair the British Psychological Society's Psychosis and Complex Mental Health faculty. And in my clinical work, I work with people who are homeless in a GP practice, and I also work as an organisational consultant, so I work with staff teams about their well-being. And to say thank you to all our speakers. You clearly put a lot of your personal selves in your professional lives, and that's very much appreciative. And to Luciana for talking about, bringing in the P word, poverty. and for Deborah for bringing in the L word, love, and also the S word, strength. So thank you for that. I'm also preoccupied with the how. This whole conference is full of the what we can do, brilliant ideas. I was at a human rights workshop yesterday from our colleagues from Sweden. Lots of brilliant ideas about the what, but it's the how. And this is another example of how we don't use what we know. Because there's decades of research about what happens when people come together in groups to affect change and how anxiety-making that is. And we don't always pay attention to things like power, leadership, followership, and all those anxieties that come about, which is why, a shameless plug for the workshop I'm doing at 2 o'clock, we're actually talking about the how, because that's really, really important to pay attention to the how and the dynamics, and we've got a lot we can learn from a lot of different traditions about the how.
Thank you.
Oh, and there's a GP in Canada who routinely screens everyone about economics and their poverty situation, and if they're poor, he refers them to people that will help them not be so poor, and he does that routinely as part of his healthcare.
That sounds sensible. Gentleman at the front there.
My name is Peter Groot. I'm from the Netherlands, and together with Jim van Os, I've been working on developing a way to help people to stop or to stop using psychotropic medication, or to at least try to be able to reduce this slowly. And this is a concrete solution, and actually it's available for patients in the Netherlands, and recently there has been interest out of England. And I want to use this occasion, especially since there are politicians here present, to point you to a petition of one of your countrymen, James Moore, who has petitioned to Secretary of State Jeremy Hunt to provide tapering strips to help users who want to stop taking anxiety and depression drugs. And this is not so much developing the system because we now have it, it's about the reimbursement of it. So it could be done right away. And in Holland, actually, we have a fight with insurance companies about it because they say, we have to pay more in the very short term, and they don't pay any attention to the benefits in the end. But this is something, if you talk about a concrete solution, if you talk about the how, this is a practical instrument that is useful for doctors and for patients, for both of them, and which makes possible a different way of dealing with drugs, talking about drugs, and so on. So that's my message. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a few more people. Who's next? It looks like Jen's is there near the microphone. There's a gentleman there, and there's someone in the middle. So I can see a few people at least, but it's very hard to see from up here.
My name is Miomir Milovanovic. I am a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. I really enjoyed listening to all the talks. I just want to say something from my experience, and my colleagues, to really point, maybe to say, Robin, when you were saying about different factors, you were saying, we cannot do anything about childhood adverse effects. Okay, I'm not criticizing. I just want to say that in psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic psychotherapy, we are really witness every day in practice how essential are relationships. How really I think that human beings can exist only in relationships. We cannot exist outside of relationships, and how this relationship is formed from the very first day. When I came to this country 25 years ago, I was absolutely struck when I heard that my colleague has only 3 months of maternity leave. I couldn't understand that, particularly after having 2 children. How somebody can leave the child after 3 months. Now, I know now it's a bit better, but motherhood is not valued here. Relationships are not valued. I think there is a long tradition of fear of attaching, particularly in northern countries, and maybe that's connected with what you were saying about South and North divide. And what Luciana was saying about Sure Start, that was really very important. But I think it could be done much more. Mothers and parents could be supported from day one. And I'm thinking about health visitors, Sure Start centers. We can do much more on prevention that. If we provide support for that, this will affect all other factors like cannabis use or whatever is connected with these early relationships that are actually within our minds and affect us throughout life. I want to say that this is also absolutely important. Very often we declare that, but we forget how important are therapeutically. But saying that, I want to kind of point again how it is not simple and easy to enter into a good relationship with whatever, whether from service user side or from professional side, how it is very demanding and could be very frightening experience to enter in open relationship. And that for this, we need a lot of additional support, additional training for that. And this is something that we kind of very often lose sight of. And as Robin, in your slides, there was a point how actually service users were saying, oh, good relationships were crucial. But they don't just happen. We have to provide support for these relationships to be happen and maintained. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We've got time for about 2 more, which is no time. So if we could keep it brief, thank you.
Thank you. Is it on? Can you
Yes.
hear me? I'm Judith Moss, and I'm an art therapist and art psychotherapist. I really empathise with our last speaker about relationship, which is at the centre of our practice and has been since 1940. I also am very grateful to our speaker from Massachusetts, who encouraged me through her sharing to share my thoughts that my son and I have a property by the sea which we would very much like to offer as a therapeutic...
Can you take the microphone a bit closer?
We have a property by the sea which we would very much like to offer as a small therapeutic waiting or recovery centre for people suffering. And if we showed welcome and support, we would welcome support and ideas from anyone here who would help us with that. I have actually mentioned it in an email to ISPS. I've been a member for about 6 years, and I would very much value some feedback from people about that. I feel very passionate about relationship and everything that's being said here. Thank you.
It's very generous. Okay, Jen's first. Just Jen's first, I think, because he's been waiting. Thank you.
One thing first. Thanks for showing the way, Deb. First of all, I'm a professional voice hero, and on the side I work as an occupational therapist and occasionally photography. I want to say one thing. I think this is also a philosophic question. We need to change the way we think about mental health. I have a brain damage also. The brain damage was from being knocked down. I got so much more help for my brain damage than I ever got from suffering from voice hearing. I think we need to show society around us that what is important is to show that recovery is not just for medical problems, but also for psychological problems. And you can actually lead a perfectly normal life. In Sweden, they made a study, and the Swedes have to correct me if I remember wrong, but they made a study where instead of giving medicine in a commune to outpatients, they gave them, I think, something like 500 krona a month, and that was more effective than medicine.
20 seconds, John Reed said. Okay, I will do. Thank you, Debra, that you give me the chance to see that all these people are with us, user survivors. I'm a patient. And thank you that you are on our side. Thank you. I'm here, that I'm standing here because your work has saved my life and has learned me philosophy even. And there is a second, and the second thing is, we want to build up good relations, and what we need, and what I wish from you is that we give you a safe space to have fightings and quarrelings with you. That's all. Thank you, Debra.
Sorry. We have 5 minutes left, and I don't want to steal from Kwame's time, because that would be a loss. What I'd like to ask of the three panelists, and Jan Olav if you'd like, is 1 minute. 1 minute of 1 or 2 points, brief. Look at one bit brief. Things that you want to tell, that you want to share, that you want to reflect on, but make it count. If you like, we can go first so you can think about that, or have you got them planned?
I could perhaps just mention one thing. I think all professional groups have got to assess how effective or ineffective what they're doing is. And one thing that the College of Psychiatrists, which is much abused in the UK, has done is to initiate a biannual audit of every psychiatric service in England. So every 2 years, they send out people to different psychiatric hospitals and they assess the care of 100 people taken at random. And you can actually now look up under schizophrenia audit, what is the quality of care of people. I think the most important thing is the quality of care. You can look up the quality of care of any psychiatric service. You can look at it in Liverpool, you can look at it for my services in South London. For example, our psychiatric services have a sort of good standard of mediocrity, which you know, we often think we're a big teaching hospital, but in practice, patients and relatives rate some of our services very badly, but they rate, for example, our psychological services, our pharmacy very well, but they say in a crisis we're absolutely hopeless. And in the future, chief executives of different psychiatric services are going to be judged on how their services score. And I think this will be much more important than as a way of ratcheting up the care. British psychiatric services, they're preoccupied with the cost of things, not the quality of care. But I think this is one way in which we can actually address the varying quality of care in different trusts so that everybody knows which is a rubbish service, which is a good service, what has to be improved.
Thank you.
Well, I think this is one of the few panels where there's been the most agreement amongst all the speakers and from the contributions from the floor. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this really vital discussion. Some really important contributions from the floor. If I can just refer to, is it Che's point about the how? Have I pronounced your name right? The point about the how, I'm sat before you today as one politician, but I certainly can't make the change by myself. And I'm going to kind of do a bit of participation as my kind of final point and throw it back to you, essentially, in terms of how we can together make the change that we all want to see. I appreciate you all come from different countries and your democracies will work in different ways, but can I ask you to put your hand up if you've ever written to your locally elected representative or your nationally elected representative about something to do with an issue in your area. If it's to do like some issue to do with crime or an issue to do with your bins or an issue locally. Right up in the air, if you've written ever to your local representative, your national representative. And can I now ask you to put your hand up if you've gone to see your local representative or your national representative about either your experience or the work that you do in psychosis. This is actually more hands than what I normally ask an audience like this. It's relatively fewer hands. If everyone in this room after this conference goes back to your relative countries and goes to speak to either your local representative or particularly your national representative about your experience, about the issues that you experience about as a user, as a service user, and use by experience the things that you think ultimately will make a difference. And if you go and sit face to face, if you have that opportunity like we do in our country through MP surgeries, I can assure you, me with other people will be able to do more to affect the change that everyone in this room wants to see. Thank you.
Gosh, what I was thinking is, I don't know why we just don't start our own service with the people in the room here. That would be an interesting thing to do. And like my colleagues, I think what is surprising is how like-minded we are. I think the gap has closed in lots of ways, and that you finally become enlightened. Thank you. Thanks to us, of course. And I suppose the only thing that really struck me, I was thinking, I remember something that Margaret Mead said. She said something like, never underestimate what a group of committed people can do to change the world. And I thought, good on you, Margie. But then I thought I'd like to change it just slightly, and I thought I might change it to, never underestimate what a group of committable people will do to change the world. So I ask you to sign up. This is secretly what we're here to recruit for. Thank you.
On behalf of the ISPS UK and Executive Committee, I'd love to thank our speakers and also those of you that contributed. So many didn't have the opportunity, but I hope you carry on these conversations through the rest of the conference. Thank you.